session. Today we have Angelina Lupini and Charles Baldwin. They will share with us their vision about designing inclusive user experience with the aim to get you more comfortable talking and thinking about inclusive practices. Angelina is a current Master in User Experience Design student at Barcelona Technology School. She has a design and business management background and a long history of working in the public and nonprofit sector, especially working and volunteering with disability community. Charles is a professional theater artist and leads a universal participation initiative at the Mass Cultural Council in Boston, United States. Thank you all. Well, I will leave the floor to you now. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I will be sharing my screen now. And let's get started. Okay, so I'm just gonna pull up my chat box so I can see what you guys are all saying. Anyways, so hi, I'm Angelina Lupini. I am an Asian American cis woman, so that means that my pronouns are she, her, hers. And I've been working with the disability community for a long time. That's actually where I met Charles. We worked together at the Mass Cultural Council for, I don't know, the last 5 years or so. And yeah, that's me.
And good morning, and really delighted to be here. My name is Charles Baldwin. And for those of you who might just be listening in as opposed to viewing in, I'm an older white gentleman with beard, glasses, and a comb back mohawk. Today I am wearing a yellow and red checked shirt. And I'm calling in from my studio in Somerville, just north of Boston in Massachusetts. I'm a theater artist that has worked with people with disabilities for many years. And back in the day, I was even a bit of an activist. I do not identify as disabled, but I do identify as queer, and I do identify as old. So again, really happy to be here. And Angelina, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, anytime, happy for it. So what are we covering today? Today we're talking about inclusion. So basically, the session will cover issues like disability, gender, and race so that we can be better advocates in our workplace for inclusion. So this session will also be useful for interacting directly with users as we do in UX design, and also being comfortable with some inclusive writing practices for UX writing. Because we're discussing language, this translates into written language as well. So just a brief overview about what we'll be talking about today. I won't go too into detail because we do have a lot to cover. So let's just jump right in. First things first, I really want to set some agreements and norms for this session because we are going to be talking about some uncomfortable things today. So just letting you know, this is a safe space and a brave space. There's no wrong ideas and we're totally judgment-free. So please interact with us in the chat. We're going to be asking questions throughout, so it would be really helpful for us and for you all to get your questions answered immediately. So that being said, Charles, are you okay with these norms?
I am. I appreciate best intentions, recognize that sometimes speaking might seem like a risk, but I agree with you. This is about an idea exchange, and the idea is to be bold in some of these concepts because that will help, of course, create change.
Amazing. So let's just give the audience members like 20 seconds to digest the information and really think about it. And if you want to add anything to these agreements, please do that now. We'd love to hear if you have anything that you want us to agree on. So I'll just give you 20 seconds of silence to think about it. Okay, well, I'm going to assume that we're all okay with those agreements since no one is writing in the chat. But now I would like for you to write, do you have any expectations of this session? Anything that you really want us to cover today? We'll do our best to cover those topics, but we do have a lot of content. So if you don't find the answers you're looking for, feel free to contact us afterwards on the side, or we can follow up with any resources as well. So what are your expectations for this session? I see people are using the Q&A part. How do I open this section?
All right. It says, get to know more about inclusivity. And there's a thanks in there. So a little bit of generosity, always nice.
Mhm.
And I think that we will be able to address that within our time today.
For sure.
Inclusion is action. So
Absolutely. All right, well, let's get started then. All right, so we're just going to start off with some basic buzzwords. Like, you're going to hear these words a lot when you're talking about this field, right? And this acronym idea is something that Charles and I actually really like to use. We use this in our past work. And it's basically just taking each piece, like inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. You'll hear this in many different ways and forms, right? Like, what is there? DE&I, D&I, belonging. There's so many different ways that this is addressed in the field, but this is what I like to use personally.
yeah, and it's a good one. I like that it's an acronym, but at the same time, it is about that creative thinking, an idea. I love that.
Exactly. So diversity, inclusion, and implicit bias, this is 3 really big topics, right? And I just want to get us on the same page of what we're talking about today. So Charles, do you have any input about these words or anything that we should really pay attention to?
Well, I always think, sometimes when we're talking about this, it can seem very passive. When I think about diversity, I think about, again, the real world, not the diversity of the individual, but the diversity of our humanity. I said earlier, I think inclusion is an action verb, that it's not just a static, but it's dynamic. It's intentional. And implicit bias is something that we all need to address. We come with all of our own DNA, and how we, if we're aware of it, then we can try to work through it. And I think that's what's important, is that those little biases that you have that affect how you act and how you think, and those can be changed.
Exactly. And this implicit bias is so informed by how we are, the environment we grew up in, the society, the way society teaches us. And it's really important to unwrap those things and question yourself in order to make a positive change, right?
Yes.
Yeah, totally. And for me, inclusion is, like you said, action-based, and it's really about full participation. It's not just, okay, is that person in the room, but is that person able to participate in that room? It's really about participation.
Yes. And I think sometimes people, they often use the metaphor of the party, being invited to the party, and that's great. However, throwing the party, choosing the music, and determining the menu is also good. So
Exactly. Yeah. So here's some more buzzwords: ableism, tokenism, and intersectionality. So what's up with these, Charles?
these are big. These are big. Ableism, like other isms, racism, sexism, is the systems that oppress people with disabilities, that differentiate them, that separate them from us. That whole othering thing that happens, and it's a bias that sort of runs rampant through many workings with people with disabilities. So this is really the flip side of disability justice.
Totally.
Tokenism is I always call it the one-off, the idea that you've met one person who's deaf, so you've met everybody. That's so not the case. This is really about not only individuals, but about recognizing that one person can't speak for everybody. I can't speak for all old white men.
Yeah, and I also like to link this to this, like, what they call like inspiration porn. So having this one person, let's say a person who's deaf, being so inspirational because they're able to do XYZ, and that's really not okay, and not it's really frowned upon, actually. So make sure that you're not tokenizing because of a disability or something like this. Yeah.
Well, and you brought up inspiration porn, which is very cutting edge as a phrase right now. And it really has so much to do with being inspired by a person with a disability who has gotten up and gone to work. It's,
Exactly.
you know, taking the commonplace and just being inspired. Sometimes it's tied to thinking about disability as a metaphor for the human condition, as opposed to just a real life experience by many people. So
totally. And for me, intersectionality is really everything tied into one. You know, people aren't just one identity. People have multiple identities. So you can be Black and gay, and that's an intersection, right? Because you have two identities here. So really, and having fluidity in these identities is super important to recognize.
yeah, I agree. And I think it ties to not only the multiple identities that we may hold, but the fighting against the silo, the segregation of a type of person. And I think that's super important to recognize that the fabric of our lives is far more nuanced than a single badge.
Yeah, I could not agree more. Yeah. So moving away from buzzwords, but still kind of staying within like topics, equality versus equity. Can anyone in the chat tell me what you think that the difference is between these two words?
You're going to have to jump right in, Angelina.
Yeah, maybe. I'll give you a second to type, but okay, we have equality is everyone is the same. Cool. Equity is about fairness. Nice. We have equality means each individual or group of people is given the same resources or opportunities. And equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equal outcome. Great. Equality is given the same treatment to everyone. Equity is needs-based. Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like equity leads to equality. Okay. Equity is taking into account the differences. Equity is being impartial. Okay, let's jump right in then.
Excellent.
So we have a little illustration here, and all those answers were really great. Thank you all for participating. Yeah, equality is these people have the same resources, but their situations are not the same. And here we have equity, where people are given resources that are needed based on their specific situation. So why is this so important to differentiate, Charles?
Well, I think it's because although there is, within our humanity, there are so many similarities. You know, we talk about not wanting to differentiate, not wanting to other, but we do come with our own, the spectrum of our own abilities based on a series of circumstances. So to really create equity is, as somebody said, is about fairness. And in some ways it's about distribution. So in the cartoon, you know, the distribution means that the person who can't reach the tree has got a slightly taller ladder. That's not to say that the other person's, you know, the other person doesn't also want a tall ladder, but it really is looking at the greater picture to create a level of fairness. It's almost a level quality.
Totally. Yeah, couldn't agree more. So that being said, if this is a picture of inequality, then what do we think justice is?
You're going deep on the terms today, Angelina. This is good.
Yeah. I think the terms are really the basis which allows us to talk about these issues, though. If you don't know how to talk about it, then, you know, you might get lost. So let's jump right in. Justice is fixing a system to provide long-term equitable access. So can we unpack this a little bit?
Yeah, we've got some nice comments in the chat, because I do think justice gets bigger than equity. As you see here, you know, equitable access is built into it, but justice becomes tied to systems, the way things work, which again are generally designed with intention, which gets us later on into our conversation. And justice is really so often looking at injustice. You know, so many systems now leave so many people out. How do we get beyond majority rules and get to a sense of recognizing all the individuals and their rights?
Exactly. Yeah. And as we've seen, the systems are not equitable. So needing to change these systems in order to provide equity, that's super important. So your turn, guys. Is there any questions so far about these general terms? Feel free to type in the chat. We'll give you like a couple seconds to formulate those questions if there are any.
And there is a question in there, is equity, does equity equal a form of justice?
That's a good question. I would say, though it seems like it could, I would say it's a little bit off base, because justice is really fixing the system, where equity is providing resources to make you adaptable and like an equitable player in the current system. So justice is more about fixing, you know, let's say the incarceration system to be more fair, rather than equity is like giving people tools to avoid it, if that makes sense.
If it's not a form of justice, I would say that it's a step towards justice.
Exactly. It's more like a building block than, because how do you fix a system? By making people see equity in or the inequities within the system first. So good question.
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
So jumping into how we connect this to UX designer. So this is the universal design it's a set of principles. And universal design was developed by Ronald Mace, and he is actually was a wheelchair user, and also a designer. So he was trying to make environments, products, and communications more equitable for people with disabilities. And today we're talking about communications, obviously, because we're talking about how to talk about these things, right? So we're talking about language here. So it's more about communications, what we'll be covering today. These are the universal design principles. So as a UX designer, I think we have a few in the room. What does this remind you of? Does this remind you of anything that we've learned from UX? Totally, you got it, Cyril. Bingo, usability. So these are Nielsen and Norman's usability principles. And I won't go through all of them because, yeah, it'll be taking up too much of our time. But where are they overlapping? Like, these two sets of principles are so deeply intertwined, right? So in order to be a good designer, you have to be universal in design. It's just common knowledge now. If usability is all of these things, then you have to be universal as well. And when we talk about being a good designer, it's not just about interfaces and visuals. Of course, you'll need to meet color contrast standards and things like that, but we are also talking about every single step of the UX process. Is your research inclusive? Are your usability sessions able to be accessibly run? Are you targeting a variety of ability? Is your UX writing inclusive, or is it othering? So this is really what we're focusing on today. It's in every single step of the process. So the center of UX and UD, it's the user, right? We have to stay centric to our user in order to be more inclusive and to be able to challenge your assumptions. So that being said, words really matter. And in all parts of the UX process, you're going to be using language to engage with users, whether it's in person or via copywriting or anything like that. Language is super important to people, and how you talk to people is important, right? So let's start talking. Let's jump into disability. This is a really common topic when this is a really common topic when talking about disability, identity first versus person first. And Charles, can you give us a little overview here?
Yeah, and I think, what's so interesting about universal design, it really is the disability lens on design. And so it's radical sometimes. What becomes important when we're thinking about people with disabilities is just that, the language that we use to talk about people. And so the norm, and again, there's all sorts of variations within that as you get to know people, but the norm is always to focus on the person first, so that we're not talking about disabled in a general term, but actually people with disabilities. You've got both capital D and small d deaf that I know we'll chat about in a second, but again, the idea of a person who is deaf versus, oh, that deaf guy, defining people by their humanity first, not their abilities or their color or their age, et cetera, but starting with the humans first, which is really so much a part of this universal design principle anyway, human-centered design. Yeah.
And the caveat here is this isn't blanket though, because some people really identify with their disability, right? So if someone corrects you and you say you're talking to someone, you're like, oh, a person with autism, and they say, actually, I'm autistic, that's okay. Don't fight it. If someone tells you how they would like to be called, go with it,
Correct. Yeah, I think that's key, because that's why I always say this is the default. But as you get to know people, and again, some people do identify with their disability. I'm not a painter who is blind. I'm a blind painter. That's important to them. But the default position is generally, human first. But obviously, as you get to know people, you want to actually respect who they are and how they refer to themselves.
Exactly. So moving on, we're just going to go a little bit more deep here. Big D deaf versus little d deaf. Does anyone in the chat have an idea of what the difference is between these two forms? I have no idea. Thank you for your honesty, Amanda. Yeah, I'm going to repeat the question. So what is the difference between big D deaf and little d deaf? If you don't know, that's totally fine. Well, we're about to go into it. Nice. So Jeffrey says, we use the lowercase deaf when referring to the audiological condition of not hearing, and the uppercase deaf when referring to a particular group of deaf people who share a language, American Sign Language or some form of sign language, I guess, and a culture. Yeah, so that's exactly it. So I don't know, Charles, do you want to illuminate this for us a little bit?
Yeah, I love Jeffrey's answer. Rock on, because that's really what it is. Capital D deaf connected to deaf culture, the culture of people who share a language and practices. In America, it's American Sign Language. And growing up, again, immersed in the language of gesture, and small deaf, again, being much more of as described, an audiological condition, as opposed to the culture of people. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, spot on. So this is usually what you'll see in copywriting, like small d dash big D def. So this will be useful for anyone who's in UX writing. If you didn't know about this difference in culture before, this will be really, really useful for you. And then moving on, we have hard of hearing versus hearing impaired. And generally, we don't like to use the word impaired when talking about disability, because it implies that there's something wrong with that person. When in fact, maybe this person dealt with this or was deaf from birth, and it's not actually impairing them in any way, shape, or form. So I don't know if you have anything else to say about this, Charles.
Yeah, the only thing is that so often our perspective on disability has come from a medical model. And again, no shade against the medical scene, which has made great strides for so many people and so many conditions. However, as we think about disability justice, disability pride, it is not about being repaired. It is about living their authentic lives. So that's where language becomes so important, and we want to get away from things that diminish or less than. So the word impaired becomes the issue. And sometimes, and this goes back to ableism, the language around disability justice can sometimes get wrapped up in this idea of impairment, again, impairment and repairing. But
Or even special needs.
special needs versus specific needs, right?
Yes. Personally, special. Every time I see special needs, I like cringe a little bit inside. But it's a personal.
Just keep changing it to specific.
Yes.
It's not special because everyone has specific needs.
Exactly. So yeah, here we're talking exclusively about the deaf community, but all of these sentiments that we're talking about also apply to the other communities as well. For example, like the blind community or even wheelchair users. This applies throughout the whole spectrum of disability. So basically, if someone corrects you, just adapt, accept it, and change your language according to what they personally feel is acceptable, you know?
And I think you brought up this really good point, which will be sort of continually brought up throughout our conversation, which is this idea of don't get stuck in this idea that this work is static, and particularly because language is, again, so dynamic and ever changing. So it does require this sort of nimble alertness when thinking about people and design.
Exactly. Couldn't emphasize that enough. Yeah, so here's just a little video. Yeah, I love this video. Yeah, pity when it comes to disability is, I would say, never okay, unless someone asks you for your help or something like that. But, you know, this isn't a condition that people with disabilities are feeling bad about, you know, maybe sometimes, but it's not something that someone who is able to be, have pity for someone, because that's just reinforcing ableism.
Well, and Christina has a great comment in the chat about the word disability. And again, you know, the word disability is this umbrella term of so many human conditions. The word disability is definitely the word to use, not differently abled or specially abled or any of that. Disability is sort of the marching order. And your comment about how everyone is disabled in some way is ding, ding, ding. That's it. Once you embrace the spectrum of ability, again, what you can do as a child versus what you can do as an adult versus what you might be able to do as a senior, that's a spectrum of ability. And not all abilities get locked into identity. But again, humans come in every form, shape, and size. So.
Yeah, exactly. The whole point of this is that there's a range of ability, right? It varies. So when it comes to design, design for variety. Don't design for one set of ability, or else you're going to be cutting out like at least 20% of your profit margin, honestly.
Yeah, there is no regular.
Exactly. So speaking of, okay. Let's go into gender and identity. So personally, I identify as a cisgender woman. That means my pronouns are she, her, hers. So some of these topics I can't be I can't be the professional on, you know. So I resorted to taking some videos for you guys and doing some deep research into this. So these three topics, can anyone tell me the difference between the three here? And if not, that's totally okay. We'll go through it. No one wants to take a stab. We can go forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So here's just some icons that kind of might get you a little bit warmed up. So Christina says, biological gender talks about the biology of the body. Totally correct, yeah. So gender expression is more about how you are presenting that day. You know, it can be super fluid because one day I can wear a dress and the next day I can wear boys' clothing. So this is super fluid, it can change. And the point here is that you can't make assumptions based on someone's gender expression, because someone can be dressing more masculine, more feminine, more neutral that day, and it doesn't necessarily tie to any of the other parts, you know? And gender identity is exactly, Jesus says gender identity is what gender someone chooses to identify as. Yeah, so this is what people feel their brain is, you know, like they feel a woman, so they're she, her, hers, or non-binary, they, them. So this is really important when addressing people, not making assumptions based on your gender expression and linking it to your gender identity automatically. It's always safe to use they until you explicitly know how people are identifying. Whereas biological sex, which is what Christina said, is about the biology of the body. Yeah, this is what people were assigned when they were born. So someone said, yeah, you look like a woman to me, or you look like a male to me, and this is what you are. And that's not necessarily how people identify. So this is super important distinction to make, especially when you're writing and talking to people, and when you're doing maybe form fields for an app to log in or something like this. Do you have anything to add here, Charles?
Yeah, I think that this can be tough sometimes. The world wants everything to be in a binary situation. Things are black or white, people are male or female. And so much about our conversation is about the nuance and the margins. So it's greater than the binary. It's all the parts in between. And when thinking about gender in this same constructive way, it can be confusing, but as we've seen, people come in all sorts of shapes, sizes, colors, and genders. And that is, again, that's the real world. So
Exactly. So just going into some technical copywriting stuff. This is something I pulled from the references down, Miss Powers. She's awesome. And yeah, transgendered versus transgender. These are just common copywriting mistakes that happen that are just like grammatically incorrect. You know, like you cannot be transgendered. It's not something that happens. It's just, this is an identity, it's a noun. So transgender is the way to address this. And yeah, just some little technical differences that maybe note so that when you're copywriting in the future, you're able to do this in a more eloquent and correct manner.
and again, this could be a very nuanced conversation. And so getting the umbrella concepts down is important, because as you meet individuals, you will meet people who don't identify with their trans quality, but identify as a single gender, even though there may, from our perspective, have been a journey and a transition.
Exactly. Not all transgender people choose to use trans in their identity. So that's super important to note. Thank you. And here is Ada Powers. She's just going to give us a little example of something that she's dealt with in her own life with an app.
Here's a personal example from my life. So Fitbit, my little Fitbit tracker website has a area where I put in my information, and it's asking me here for my sex. And so I put female, but I don't really know. I don't really have a high confidence in why it's asking me that information. Is it asking me sex because it's trying to ask about my gender? It's trying to ask if I'm a man or a woman or something else. And it is just kind of clunky. And so it says female and it says sex. I said, okay. Or is it asking about my dominant hormones? So Fitbit is a fitness company and they make fitness trackers. People with different blends of dominant hormones have different metabolisms. They could be using that to inform their algorithm about how many calories I burn or how the calories I intake affect me. But I don't get that information. I just see sex female. Or, you know, Fitbit has period tracking capabilities now with some of their products. So if I say female, are they assuming that I have a uterus and that I experience periods? And is that the sole setting that is going to be used to decide if I'm going to be advertised period tracking services or not? So we can see here that each of those use cases would provide, like, I don't have a uterus, but I am an estrogen dominant person. I take estrogen all the time, and my gender is woman. And I just don't know when it's asking, what is my sex? Is it female? Where they're coming from with that. And if they, you know, we can file this under inclusivity helps everyone, because if they told me what they were looking for, I might be able to give them better information, and they would be serving more people most likely. Apologies if they're.
Yeah, so if you're interested in learning more about this, this talk, which I've linked here, it's a full 1-hour webinar similar to this, just talking again about inclusive language. So feel free to check that out for deeper analysis. So misgendering, what do you do if you misgender someone? So this is Jeffrey Marsh and giving a little bit of advice about this. So apologize briefly, restate the sentence with the correct pronouns, and then move on. And definitely don't make the same mistake twice. Yeah, and don't make people feel uncomfortable. Don't harp on the, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. Like, yeah, they get it. Don't make it even more weird for them than it already is, you know? And this link here at the bottom has like a really nice blog about this issue. And just going into another copywriting snafu about non-binary people. Basically, you have to use the person as the noun. You can't just be a non-binary, which is a common mistake that happens. And then the most important thing here that I think is most important is the last part. So Charles, can you tell us the difference between preferred pronouns and then pronouns?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, this is such a great example. Preferred pronouns still sort of implies there's something different. There's something special, as opposed to just, these are my pronouns. So preferences versus, this is just who I am.
Yeah, exactly. The preference versus identity, you know, this is super important, especially when you're copywriting. So. And then I know that we're talking in the context of English right now, but I also wanted to include this video about the Spanish language, because the Spanish language is gendered, right? It's feminine or masculine for everything. So I just wanted to put this in because I found it really interesting, copywriting in different contexts.
Como sabes, el español es una lengua que admite únicamente dos géneros. El masculino, el chico, y el femenino, la chica. El género neutro como tal no existe. Pero ¿qué pasa? A veces estás en una fiesta con amigos y amigas y querés preguntarles si quieren algo para tomar. Bueno, normalmente en español las personas usarían el plural masculino, es decir, chicos, ¿quieren tomar algo? Bueno, hoy queremos contarte que el lenguaje inclusivo o lenguaje no sexista es una alternativa que propone la igualdad de género en términos gramaticales y lingüísticos. ¿Cómo se usa? Es súper fácil. Cada vez que tengas un adjetivo, un artículo, un sustantivo o un pronombre plural, simplemente tenés que cambiar la O del final por una E. Entonces, volviendo a la fiesta, diríamos, chiques, ¿quieren tomar algo? Actualmente, el lenguaje inclusivo no está aceptado por la Real Academia Española, que es el organismo que regula el uso del español. Pero de todos modos, es utilizado principalmente entre personas jóvenes de Latinoamérica y España. La E también es una alternativa para referirse a las personas no binarias. El pronombre personal de las personas no binarias es elle. En inglés sería they. Si querés aprender más español, prueba nuestra clase gratis. Hasta la próxima.
Yeah, so hopefully that helped a little bit. I know maybe, I don't know what audiences the people here will be designing for, but it's just good to note that, yeah, there are some languages that are super gendered, so being aware of it. Sorry, just restarting it again. So speaking of, let's talk about race and ethnicity. And this is a really big topic. So we're not going to cover everything today, that's for sure. But I think getting started here, maybe getting more comfortable talking about race and ethnicity, it'll be helpful. So this slide is more relevant for people who are targeting American audiences. But Charles, can you tell us why this is so important to distinguish?
Well, America has a very racist history. So, and talking about race, you really want to be specific and not contribute to harm. Obviously, African American is a term that can be used quite generally, but distinctly refers to people who have come from the continent of Africa. And that in America has primarily been because of slave labor. Blackness, capital B blackness, is about the culture as it exists and sort of the broadness of color that exists. So that could be both black and brown. It isn't continent derived, but rather more culturally derived.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the acronym we see a lot, BIPOC, just Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. So basically talking about the marginalized groups. That being said, minority. I have a problem with the word minority, but basically the problems here is it implies lesser than or smaller. It's not necessarily the minority, let's say globally, for sure, not the minority. And also in certain systems that you're talking about, if you're talking about a system where the majority is Black, using the word minority is not even correct. So, and it's also not holding people accountable for the deep history that Charles was just talking about.
I identify as a person of color. I don't like being called a minority because there's nothing minor about me or what I'm doing or anybody here. So once you continue to utilize these terms, it's like a psychological warfare. Like when you tell people that this is a minority of a development group, the term minor means smaller or little. So you are saying that we are less than the other races if you call us the minority race. Hopefully, I'm not sure if this is the right stage for it, but hopefully we can kill the word minority after this and we can find another way to address myself.
Yeah, I really like this video because he says the word psychological warfare, which I think is so powerful when you're talking about language, because maybe it's not physically harming someone in what we think of normal warfare, but mentally it's so emotionally driven, right? And language
embedded in our DNA when words are used over and over and over, so that they become something that you believe, and that again they're going to affect how you express yourself, how you live your life. Yeah, I like that term too.
Exactly, I cannot stress that enough. So that being said, instead of minority, what can we use? This is a term I like to use. I like to say historically excluded or historically marginalized, because not only does it acknowledge that, hey, there's a deep history here of intentional exclusion or marginalization, but it's not belittling people. It's not saying you're minor, I really like this term. I also like to use this term for genders, like historically excluded genders, because it's more inclusive than just saying women, because it's not just women who have been historically excluded,
But out of all of the questions, my favorite one is still the classic, where are you from? Because I've lived in quite a few places, so this is how the conversation usually goes. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from Boise, Idaho. I see, but where are you really from? I lived in South Dakota for a while. Okay, what about before that? I lived in North Dakota. Okay, I'm just gonna cut straight to the chase here. I guess what I'm saying is, have you ever lived anywhere far away from here where people talk a little differently? Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yes, I have. I used to live in Texas.
Yeah, so I really love this example because if you're going to ask a question, be pointed with it, and think about, why do I need to know this information when you're working with users? Why is this information important to me as a UX designer? And I get asked this question all the time, oh, but where are you really from? Or even just the question, where are you from? I'm like, oh, I don't know what to say. And so being explicit in your language is super important when it comes to this. Okay, so just wrapping up before our question and answer section. This is what not to do versus what you should do. So definitely don't make assumptions. Don't think that what you think is what's reality, because every single person is different. Be respectful about those differences. Don't make othering statements. When you're working with users, you want people to be open, as honest as possible. And if you're making othering statements, you're kind of blocking your UX experience, right? And acknowledge that people have different experiences and privileges in life. So acknowledging those differences is okay, as long as you're not being othering. And finally, don't feel guilty. Just face and fix your mistakes. Just continue learning. It's all about continuing to grow and learn.
Yeah, that last one always hits me because I think it's so easy. There's something about us wanting to be seen as perfect, as without mistakes, and this wrestling with being seen as a little messy sometimes, but at the same time, it's always about learning and transforming. Shame, there's no room for shame. That comes from other places, but rather our journey towards inclusion, an understanding of the human population as it really is always about learning and curiosity and ultimately wonder. So
exactly, could not agree more. And then these are some general guidelines to follow. So like I said, again, actively and renounce your assumptions. Question, why are you thinking that way? Question your assumptions. This is kind of a rule in all of UX when you're researching. Why are you thinking in a certain way? Try to be as unbiased as possible. Ask if you don't know. If you don't know someone's identity and you don't know how to address them, ask them. That's okay. You can ask someone how they want to be represented. It's like asking what's your name, And while it's okay to ask about a topic in general, it's not that person's responsibility to educate you. You should educate yourself. So try and Google it before asking a person to be the token spokesperson for that entire group of people. That's a kind of a really big general rule.
I want to pause there because I think that's super important. Again, this whole idea of you meet one person who's deaf, you've met one person who is deaf. And I think when designing Unmasked, the idea, again, is to look for that regular person, that typical person. And you really want to get away from marginalized folks always having to educate on whatever condition may have intentionally marginalized them in the past. It is up to ourselves to educate ourselves. So
exactly. Also, when designing, when it relates to UX design, think about what you need to know. What information is important? Why are you asking someone for their gender? Is it their gender identity? Is it their sex? What are you asking? Why are you asking it? Is this information you really need as a designer, or is it irrelevant? And this is super important when it comes to UX research and design, and especially copywriting. And finally, like we said before, things change. Language is constantly changing. What was the cool word now is not the cool word from 20 years ago. So really just keep learning, because you're never going to be perfect, and this field is always constantly changing, and you're never going to have one answer and then this is the way it's supposed to be. No, this field is constantly shifting, morphing, progressing. So just keep learning and continue improving, and that's really the biggest sentiment here. Finally, we are at the end of our presentation, but if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. We are happy to answer.
Well, I noticed, and again, other questions may be coming, but Amanda had a question at the very beginning about advocating for inclusion in our companies. And I don't know if Amanda wants to sort of unpack that a little bit, because again, we could answer in many different ways. Advocacy itself is partly what we're doing, advocating for inclusion.
And I think if you're talking to, let's say, a stakeholder, and they're like, why do we even need to have alt text or something like this? I think looking at numbers is always impactful with stakeholders. So the fact is 20% of the US population identifies as having a disability. And that you would never ignore 20% of your users just because, oh, it's only 20%. You know, you're ignoring a huge margin. So I would show this number. Yeah, Amanda says, how is the approach showing numbers, stats, telling stories? I think it can be a combination of those. You know, not only showing stats, but also showing that you know what you talk about. That's why I wanted to do this session, because first step is being able to talk about this. If you don't know how to talk about it, then people will think that it's not important and it's not something that you as a designer care for. And I would link it directly, because we were talking about how usability, the Nielsen-Norman principles connect to the universal design principles. I would connect like, oh, but if you're following design principles and we want to be clear or I don't know, let's say minimalistic. Minimalistic is good for people with neurodiverse disabilities. So, you know, pointing out how it's overlapping might be helpful as well as showing numbers like, why are we ignoring 20% of our population, our user base, you know?
I think that those points are key, because I work in an environment where I am applying universal design principles throughout cultural organizations. So my approach, Amanda, is twofold. One, I often will start talking about disability under the auspice of age, because if we're lucky enough, we all age, and aging itself can have, not always, but can have disabling agents. So sometimes that will get people to recognize. The other is our use of the word inclusion. The flip side of that is exclusion. So are you wanting to exclude 20% of your potential market? So if inclusion doesn't land, sometimes exclusion will. And again, ability under the umbrella of age often resonates with people who are often aging themselves. So.
Exactly. And, you know, we're always talking about innovative tech, at least in our masters. So if we're looking at, okay, we want the newest tech, we're always targeting the youngest generations, the youngest market. But then talking about this age, how can this then, if our user now is 20, in 20 years, our user will be 40. So look, and if they're going to be a lifetime user, how are we going to keep them using the service, you know? So we have to think about how variety changes over, ability changes over time, and how ability is variety, you know? Everybody has a different set of abilities. And really harping on this to your stakeholders might resonate, because you don't want to lose users. You want to keep customer loyalty. So that also could be something that you could bring up to your stakeholder.
And I certainly know some of, Angelina and I share many phrases, and one of them is sometimes design for the margins and the center will come.
Exactly. Like if you're designing easily, then everyone can use it. You know, if you design for the easiest possible interaction, then everyone will be able to use it inherently. It's inclusive. Inclusion creates better usability for everybody. It benefits everyone. For sure. Yeah, I see a lot of thanks here. Thank you guys for listening and staying with us today. I know it was really basic and 101, but I hope that it will help you be able to talk about these in your future careers as designers. Is there any other questions, or are we coming to a close?
Yeah, great questions so far. Really happy to have been a part of this conversation, because these wrestling with ideas is so much a part of this.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's just learn from your mistakes. That's all we can do as humans, right? Awesome. I don't see any other questions, but we'll leave it open for you. Thank you, guys. Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you.
Thank you very much,
Bye.
Angelina and Charles, for sharing your vision in this very interesting topic. Well, if you don't have any more questions, well, it's been great to have you both here. And well, thanks everybody for being in this session today. So take care, and well, see you in the next BTS talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Take care. Bye bye.
Nice being here.
You too. Bye.